When you hear Opus Dei, what comes to mind?
For most people, secrecy, maybe the Da Vinci Code, and not much else.
But the real story is way bigger and way more troubling.
We're talking high control tactics, political influence, and a network that reaches far beyond the church.
And in this episode, we're pulling back the curtain. Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
the show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed.
And the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
and embrace a fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
No topic is off limits, and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go!
So Emma, when we started this High Control Catholicism series, I knew Opus Dei was going to have to come up.
Same here. It's one of those names people have heard, but don't always know much about beyond the stereotypes, or maybe just what they picked up from the Da Vinci Code.
Right. But when you actually start digging deeper, the reality is so much bigger. You find this web of secrecy, global financial influence, political connections, and a culture that shapes members' entire lives.
And that's not even getting into the parallels we've seen with other high-control faith traditions, evangelical purity culture, certain covenant communities, even parts of the manosphere, especially when it comes to controlling sexuality and shaping gender roles. Be aware, before starting this episode, that it will include discussions of grooming and child abuse, human trafficking, and sexual violence. Take a beat and take a breath, and make sure you're in the right headspace for this conversation. By definition of talking about Opus Dei, a secret but also deeply powerful organization, we will talk about abuses of those powers.
We've got a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Today, we are excited to welcome Gareth Gore to our podcast. Gareth is a financial journalist and editor with close to 2 decades of experience, who has reported from over 25 countries and covered some of the biggest financial stories. His writing has been published by Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters, and International Financing Review. He is the author of the book Opus, The Cult of Dark Money, Human Trafficking, and Right-Wing Conspiracy Inside the Catholic Church, and is the host of The Syndicate, which tells the behind-the-scenes stories of the biggest financial deals in history. Welcome, Gareth.
Max and Emma, greetings from London. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. So starting out, we've been doing a series on Substack on the topic of high control Catholicism. So of course, we wanted to talk to you about how Opus Dei fits into this topic. As queer Catholics, we have benefited from communities like the ex-evangelical and ex-Mormon groups that unpack and walk through harmful practices from those faith traditions. But we and others have noticed a lack of space for this dialogue within Catholicism. Your work in writing the book Opus and your participation in the HBO documentary How I Left the Opus Dei have been instrumental in the development of these conversations. But we know that for you, all of this work started because of what you uncovered in the course of your financial reporting. At what point in the process of reporting on the story of a Spanish bank did you realize this was a much bigger story than you started with?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right there, Emma. I mean, I kind of fell into this story completely by accident. So, as part of my day-to-day reporting as a financial journalist, I was sent to Spain to report on a bank that had just collapsed overnight. And, kind of as I began writing that story and reporting that story, at first it seemed like the kind of age-old story of like we've seen so many bank collapses over the past kind of 15 years since the 2008 collapse. And I thought, this certainly seemed to kind of fit that same template of, executives maybe taking too many risks, allowing things to get out of control, and not really kind of getting their hands on the problem until it was too late. And so I and every other reporter at the time wrote that story. But there's just something about the collapse of the bank that I just couldn't let go of. And, as I left the kind of immediate collapse story, I just kind of in my free time began to research the history of the bank. And I became obsessed with its chairman, this guy called Luis Taberner, who was a member of Opus Dei, a numerary member of Opus Dei. And I can explain what that means in a short time. But I was just fascinated by this guy. And my initial plan was to kind of write his life story and the story of the bank. He basically kind of transformed this bank over the course of about 5 decades, made it into one of the most successful banks in the world. And then, so my idea was to kind of narrate that rise and then talk about the collapse. But as I kind of dug deeper and deeper, I began to kind of connect all of these dots to Opus Dei, and in particular found all of these financial flows to all of these kind of crazy projects around the world, projects including, ones that recruited impoverished girls in poor countries. And so the story, began to evolve very quickly. It was I guess it was a gradual process, but then there was kind of a point where I'm just like, this actually is a story more about Opus Dei than it is about the bank or this particular banker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. And I think it demonstrates well how, Opus Dei may seem a certain way, but when you start to look closer, you start to realize there's more going on. And in the case of the bank, that there was kind of a smokescreen there. So shifting gears to talk more directly about high control practices a little bit here, your book discusses the controlling elements of Opus Dei in pretty good detail. And you've also spoken with people like Stephen Hassan, who specializes in helping people recover from controlling groups like cults. Setting aside for this purposes of this question, the flagrant abuses of human trafficking and the accusations of sexual abuse by priests within the organization, what would you say are some of the standout examples of how Opus Dei is a controlling organization for the average member? And I would like to add like a little part 2 on there, which is, how do you think that the sort of the middle managers, like the numeraries, how they play a role in the controlling element?
Yeah, I mean, the numeraries are absolutely key. And perhaps before we move on, maybe I should explain the different leadership levels. So I guess at the very top, you've got these numerary members. So these are people who've basically, dedicated their lives to Opus Dei. They're not quite vows, but they're not quite pledges, but they've decided to lead lives of chastity, poverty, and critically obedience. So they effectively become the foot soldiers of Opus Dei. Their job is to go out there to recruit the kind of everyday members, these people that are known as the supernumeraries, and to manage them or control them. So the numeraries, there are about 100,000 members of Opus Dei around the world. And the numeraries, it's kind of unclear that the organization isn't very transparent about this, but there are between, I'd say, maybe 10,000 and maybe 25,000 numeraries. The rest of the members, there are also priests. There are a couple of thousand priests, but the rest of the members are these people called supernumeraries, who are kind of everyday Catholics who've been drawn to Opus Dei, or they've been drawn to what they've been told about Opus Dei, because I think a lot of the supernumeraries don't really understand what they're part of and what's going on. So it's the job of the numeraries to recruit the supernumeraries, and recruit future numeraries, and also to I guess control them. And the way that they do this is they take, I guess, ordinary parts of Catholic life, and they kind of abuse them or supercharge them in some ways. So, of course, there's confession, and, when you have the seal of confession, everything is meant to be secret between you and the priest. Well, there have been numerous abuses of that within Opus Dei. I mean, some people would argue that it's actually kind of standard practice to abuse the seal of confession. Maybe not overtly, but certainly there are, the priest will pass on information about members to the other. So a priest will take confession with the numeraries and the supernumeraries, and will maybe relay that information back in a very subtle way to the various kind of, the bosses of Opus Dei, or maybe we'll pass information about the supernumerary back on to the numerary. I mean, the overarching goal is not the kind of spiritual well-being of the members. It's the well-being of the organization. So any information that's relayed back, there's then a process of how can we use this information to benefit Opus Dei in some way, either financially, or benefit one of the programs we have, or benefit, one of the political aims we have. And so, it's the confession is kind of sometimes used in that way. Another critical piece of being a member of Opus Dei is doing this thing that's sometimes called the confidence, sometimes called the chat. So it's meant to be a way for ordinary Catholics to go deeper into their faith. So these are spiritual guidance sessions and usually it takes place maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks. If you're a supernumerary, you'll do the chat or confidence with a numerary that's been assigned to you, by the way. You don't get to choose who you do this spiritual guidance with. And if you're a numerary, you'll generally do it with another numerary who's, more superior to you, your director. And I guess the whole, it's life coaching, but, to the nth degree. So the numerary is encouraged to ask the supernumerary or the other numerary about whatever they want to. They can ask you about your sex life. They can ask you about your work life, your political leanings, what you're thinking about, your outlook on life, your kids, they might ask you about. And again, it's a way of gleaning information, and that information is then relayed back up the hierarchy, and, decisions are made about how best to use that, to benefit the organization. So I guess at the core of the way that the control happens is by kind of taking these kind of core tenets of Catholicism and abusing them and turning them to the advantage of Opus Dei. As Catholics yourselves, I mean, it's, the way that these kind of tenets are meant to work is to help you as a Catholic to kind of reach a higher level, or to cleanse your soul or whatever, or to reach heaven. But that's not the way that these methods work in Opus Dei. It's very much to benefit the organization, quite often to the detriment of the well-being of the people receiving it.
Most definitely. And I think that resonates with what Max and I have found in the High Control series overall. Kind of, in some ways, this may be too strict, but in some ways it's very true, especially for queer and trans people, kind of this dehumanization and self-sacrifice for the functionality of organizations, and preying on vulnerable populations through this bureaucratic, just as you talk about, system of leadership that I think is really, really important. On the topic of Josemaría Escrivá himself, we wanted to explore his, quote, cult of personality, unquote, something that Max and I have explored additionally through our investigations of church militant Michael Voorhees, specifically alongside other figures within this Catholic influencer circle. And get your perspective on what made him so successful in building Opus Dei into a high control group. I think this is perfect from what you just ended on. Was it primarily his controlling personality, his skill at networking and forging connections within the church hierarchy and political circles, or perhaps specifically his strategic financial manipulations that gave Opus Dei such significant power? Can you speak more to that?
I mean, I think probably all of the above. I mean, to a certain extent, I would say that the cult of personality that now exists in Opus Dei around its founder, Josemaría Escrivá, is something that's manufactured. I mean, in the very early years of Opus Dei, so to go back to kind of the story of how the organization came about, Escrivá, this young Spanish priest, supposedly went on retreat in October 1928 and received this vision for a new organization that would help ordinary Catholics to kind of go deeper into their faith. So he started out with something a quite benign, quite benevolent idea of, basically a way of helping Catholics to just be better Catholics. And the whole philosophy was that there was no need to become a priest or a nun if you wanted to be a more serious Catholic. At that stage, that was the only way of kind of going deeper. His idea was that as a teacher or a doctor or as a homemaker or whatever you did in life, simply by striving for perfection and offering that perfection up to God, that was a way of he called it kind of, saintliness in ordinary life. So he started out with this idea, but he was, I think it's accurate to say that he was wholly unsuccessful in recruiting in the early years. He really struggled to recruit members to this new kind of philosophy. There's kind of one story that I recount in the book where, he was so desperate at one stage, he was so disappointed and I guess despairing at his lack of success in recruiting people that, he was tending to a dying woman, and he said to her, when you reach the next life, would you do me a favor? Could you intercede for me? Could you help me to recruit people? And, so his failure to recruit in the first few years, I think, led him to really question what he was doing and led him to come up with this methodology of basically grooming people to become members. And so what he did was he set up this academic academy. So it was it was aimed at university students. It was basically they offered them extra classes after the normal classes at university. It was a way for them. There were kind of these study sessions, and they were aimed at architecture and law students. And he would use the academy to basically kind of he would identify, to begin with, young men, and later kind of went on. He targeted women as well, but he would, I guess, identify people who were ripe for grooming, and then he would shower them with attention, gifts, and kind of really go after them one by one. And as he began to work out which methods worked, which methods didn't work, and in some ways, I hate to say this, but you almost have to take your hat off to him. He was, these days, cults are, there's a great awareness around cults and cult methods, but this was the early 1930s. He was operating effectively in a vacuum, but he was working out bit by bit what worked, what didn't work. And, as he worked out what worked, he began to draw up a set of instructions. He already had an idea that as the organization grew, he wouldn't be able to do all of the recruiting himself. And so he he actually wrote down these rules for how to recruit and groom young kids. And, these were rules like, you have to pick them off from the crowd. Don't try to target a group. You need to go after each potential recruitee individually. Instruct them not to tell their friends or family that they're thinking about joining Opus Dei, because you don't want them to be, persuaded to dissuaded from joining us. There were other rules like never target anyone over the age of 25, because those kinds of people ask too many questions. They're too set in their ways. All of these red flags today, these are, cult recruitment 101 red flags. Back in the day, back then, I guess people asked fewer questions, but yeah, it's certainly, he hit on a really quite successful and quite efficient way of, and also operating these kind of, these schools it kind of gave him access to a wide selection of young, impressionable people, and by picking them off and then targeting these very efficient methods at the individuals, it was a very fruitful, I guess, way of recruiting people, and very quickly Opus Dei began to explode in size.
Absolutely. And one question that's coming to mind, Gareth, is that in the research that Max and I have done related to covenant communities, specifically, there's a great deal of overlap and mirroring that happens of initial kind of failure to establish these communities, and then a focus on people within the academic setting that I think is really interesting. Another thing that's coming to mind is also how specifically targeting young men in Catholic settings reminds me of kind of what many scholars and journalists are exploring now as kind of the growing manoverse on social media platforms. Would you be able to speak more? I appreciate you sharing about manipulation tactics and how that's part of cult behavior. What element and what role gender and sexuality played in the targeting of young men within this organization, and also how cult mentality affected ideas around gender and sexuality from the beginning?
That's kind of a really interesting issue, I think, and something I'd perhaps like to kind of delve into a bit more and do some more research into. I think, it would be certainly in more recent years, a lot of some of the members, I think a lot of members turn to Opus Dei, and I guess this has been something quite common in the Catholic Church, certainly with the priesthood and nuns as well. I think, growing up in a church that tells you that, anything other than heterosexuality is wrong, and something that, a church that tells you that, you must aspire to be part of a standard family unit. I think anyone that's been struggling with their sexuality has been, I think the priesthood and the nunnery lifestyle has been a kind of way out of grappling with those things, by setting aside your sexuality. You don't have to deal with that anymore, and you can still, stick to your Catholic beliefs. You don't have to question anything. And so I think, I've certainly spoken to men and women who have been drawn into the nunnery lifestyle as a way of not having to deal with the sexuality, basically, and then have later left and, started to kind of, I guess, rediscover the sexual side of their lives. But I think kind of, turning the clock back to, the 1930s and Spain in particular, the idea of what a man was and what a man should be, and also for women was a very kind of a very rigid thing. And I think for people that maybe didn't fit into that mold, I think Opus Dei certainly kind of preyed on those kinds of people. But I think right from the beginning, the aim of Escrivá was to influence society, and so he didn't so much care about the personal issues of each person. I guess what he wanted was people who could be manipulated. And so if you tick that box, whatever your issue was, he didn't really care whether you had daddy issues or whether you had sexuality issues or whatever you had. As long as you could be manipulated, that's kind of fine. The other thing that was very important was to recruit people from the elite, or people who could kind of fit in with the elite, who could recruit people from the elite, because the whole idea was that Opus Dei was a way of changing society and of influencing society. And the way that you do that is not by recruiting from the working classes, it's by recruiting politicians and lawyers and journalists who are in positions to kind of exert influence, and who are in a position to also recruit other people from that kind of from that environment. So I think that's kind of the and so that's why in the very early years he targeted his recruitment at the kind of top universities in Spain, because the idea was that we're recruiting tomorrow's elite. We're trying to recruit the best students, because those students will be in great jobs in 10 years time or whatever. And, it's very much the same playbook these days. Opus Dei, it's no coincidence that Opus Dei has a presence on almost every Ivy League university campus. And, almost every major university around the world, there's some Opus Dei presence, because they still want to recruit those kinds of people. But it starts much earlier as well. I mean, Opus Dei also operates this network of schools around the world. And just to come back to what I was talking about earlier about these targets, as the targeting techniques and the kind of methodology around kind of recruitment, at the Opus Dei schools, where many of the teaching posts are held by numeraries, the identification of potential recruits, the grooming of potential recruits starts at a very, very early age. We're talking like kids 9, 10, 11 years old who are invited to special clubs. They identify these kids and then they say, hey, we've got this special computer club after school, which is run by numeraries. But of course, that's not told to the kids or to the parents. Why do you come back after school, and we've got the best computers, we'll help you, or it's a photography club, or whatever it might be, and the kids are invited back, and the kind of grooming takes on, goes to the next stage and the next stage and the next stage, and eventually the kids are kind of worn down and pushed into joining the organization. Officially, Opus Dei doesn't recruit anyone under the age of 18. But that's a complete fiction, because the recruitment begins, like I say, from the early teens, and sometimes even younger. So the idea is, by getting them into this kind of process at an early age, by the time they're 16, they can then express the desire to become what they're called junior members. And then, almost the day they turn 18, they sign on the dotted line and become full-on members. But it's a very long process, which begins when the recruits are still kids.
Yes. I think that's very, very important, and ties into, as you were mentioning, specifically targeting high up members within academic universities, specifically this level of classism that is so pervasive in Opus Dei. I know for us, with the most recent election that happened here in the United States, seeing Kevin Roberts investigated by The Guardian, the architect of Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation here in the United States, having close ties to Opus Dei, is really fascinating, because, as you say, the concept of connecting people and the goal of infiltrating government and high-level official organizations in order to reshape society in the image of a Catholic community is something that's resonated in speaking with Shannon Vavich in the past about Opus Dei, with seeing and speaking with people who went through conversion therapy and covenant communities. It's a through line of reshaping politically and socially what a Catholic country will look like. Just to say that I think this is an incredibly, incredibly important conversation, and one that resonates with what we have found out about conversion therapy survivors, of many people who weren't at a place where they wanted to investigate sexuality and gender for themselves, or didn't feel comfortable turning to other outlets of high control Catholicism as a way to remain close to the church and tethered to it, but not investigate further what their lives were and what role or purpose they were going to serve, or ways in which their identities were valid and authentic. So I think what you say is super, super important. And I can't wait to see what you investigate further about gender and sexuality.
The next question I had was kind of a little bit of a different direction. I feel like what Emma just said, we could probably talk about just that for like a while.
Absolutely. 100%.
But I wanted to go in the direction of some of the reactions and press that you've received since doing this work and publishing your book. So part of that, of course, includes Opus Dei's own response, which I would say has largely been outright denial, like accusing you of lying or mischaracterizing things, rather than acknowledging the real people that have been hurt, and not just in the extreme headline-grabbing cases, but even through the everyday practices and teachings teachings of Opus Dei, which can be so relentlessly demanding that members end up burnt out and left with nothing outside of their participation in the organization. So the question I have here is, what do you think about Opus Dei's decision to dismiss the experiences of these individuals and these people, rather than take any ownership, reveals about the organization itself?
Well, I mean, I think it basically exposes Opus Dei as a deeply unchristian organization. I mean, basically they're out to protect themselves, and they have no desire to really get to the bottom of things. They have no desire to really kind of I guess, delve into what's really going inside the organization, the way things really work, the way people are manipulated and hurt. They have no desire to really investigate any of that at all. I think, I mean, it was quite telling. I mean, about 6 months before the book came out, we released the marketing material where, places like sites like Amazon are populated with, the name of the book and a description of what it's about. And, when they saw that, and I should say, by the way, that at that stage, I'd already been in conversations with Opus Dei, and I'd interviewed dozens and dozens of people, including some of the most high-ranking people in Opus Dei. So they were fully aware of what I was looking into. But when they saw the kind of marketing material around the book, they took fright. And before they'd read a word of the book, they put out a statement saying that it was all lies and that it was based on conspiracy theories and all this stuff. I mean, how you can say that without actually kind of engaging with, having read a word of the book, having, I guess that kind of tells you, it sheds a light on what their motivations are, which is to protect the organization at all costs, rather than, take these allegations on board and investigate them and get to the bottom of them. I mean, I've been a journalist for 20 years. I've seen numerous kind of, serious allegations made against people and companies. And in those situations, normally what happens is an organization says, we take this fully on board. We're going to investigate this thoroughly, or we're going to cooperate with the authorities, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. If there's any wrongdoing, then, people will be held accountable. That's not what happened with Opus Dei. From the very first minute, the tactic was to discredit me and the book. The tactic was to not engage with any of these allegations in any shape or form. And that's kind of been the kind of modus operandi ever since the book came out. We've had this kind of disinformation campaign where they've tried to discredit me as a journalist and tried to, it's been very eye-opening, I think, as well. I came to this as a non-Catholic, as a financial journalist. So I knew the media landscape in the financial and economics world quite well, but I wasn't really aware of, I wasn't really familiar with the Catholic media landscape. It's been quite eye-opening the way that Opus Dei has been able to push its message in certain parts of the Catholic media. The way that, and I won't name any particular outlets, but the way that certain outlets just take what's been fed to them clearly by Opus Dei and just kind of regurgitate that without asking any questions whatsoever is absolutely incredible. How these people call themselves journalists, I do not know. That's been really quite interesting to watch. And I guess really illustrate, it really kind of has opened my eyes to the divisions within the church and the way that some parts of the church are, very happy to use the kind of levers of power and influence to push their agenda, even if it's in complete contradiction to what the Vatican or the Pope is pushing. The way that people, completely ignore what's happening in Rome and instead just push their own political agendas. That's very clear to see in the US, but also in other countries like Spain, and across Latin America, the way that these conservative-leaning, right-wing, Catholic media organizations kind of push this agenda is just incredible. I mean, the number of times, there have just been completely false stories published about me or the book, with no, attempt to even kind of come to me to ask for my view or to ask whether something is right. It's just, there's been basically a big campaign to discredit me in the book. But I think the book speaks for itself. I mean, for all of those kind of haters and all those organizations, I just say, look, go read the book. It kind of stands for itself. And you believe what you want to believe, but the book, stands for itself.
Absolutely. And Gareth, that's something that I think both Max and I have seen as well in investigating high control Catholicism, but also a while back, the start of our masculinity series was a piece talking about how Elon Musk had subtweeted me on X. And the comments very much in the same way were not aimed at investigating the piece and discrediting the claim that gender diversity had always been part of the Catholic Church, but rather focused on deeply transphobic, sanist comments about who I was as a person. So I was so it seems more that, and very much a cult response of, it seems more that they want to discredit me as a person instead of taking seriously or unpacking what all of these accusations mean, as you say. From another angle, we also wanted to ask you about a particular response to your book. It was a review written by Matt Murray, executive editor of The Washington Reporter, who said that the earnest believers were neglected by the book. He said, quote, "Indeed, there is virtually no space devoted to exploring the spiritual lives of Opus Dei members, especially ordinary people, or consideration of the notion that its leaders, even deeply flawed ones, might hold sincere convictions. The focus of the reporting is almost solely on the leaders and their scandals," unquote. We understand why your work rightly centers exposing the abuse and manipulation you uncovered, but there's a kind of balance involved in calling out serious issues while also acknowledging the innocent people who come to the organization with good intentions. How do you think about that balance? How do you approach it? And what would you say to those who feel the sincere convictions of ordinary members deserved more attention?
The book is an expose of an organization and the way it works, its methods, and so there are victims of that methodology and of the kind of wider Opus Dei system, and I think a lot of people, both numeraries and supernumeraries, come to the organization or are drawn into the organization with good intentions. I think some of them, they're looking to be better Catholics, and they think Opus Dei is a way to help them do that. I think in many senses, many of them are victims. They have no idea of the way that the organization really operates and the way that they are being kind of manipulated and groomed into serving the organization. I think in the book, I give voice to those people and I would disagree with that particular reviewer. I think if I'm writing a book that's an expose of bad stuff that happens inside of an organization, I don't think it's my role to then have to balance that by saying, well, maybe the organization does a couple of good things. I mean, the whole point of the book is to show how this cult was born, how it started with quite good intentions, but how it became warped along the way. And, Opus Dei can speak for itself about, some of the good projects it might do around the world, if there are any, I'm not sure. But I very much came to writing the book with the idea that I needed to expose the way that these things were, really were. It's not my job to regurgitate the narrative of Opus Dei of, we just want to help you guys, when I've quite clearly demonstrated in the book that that's a false, that's a false narrative. What's actually going on is that the organization is serving itself. And so, whilst I think it's important to recognize that, yes, many people are victims of Opus Dei. People don't know what they're getting into, but they're drawn into the organization on false pretenses. These are not inherently bad people. The people that make up, even the nimries that go out there and recruit kids, they're living under this system of control and abuse. And so, they are victims themselves. Whilst it's important to recognize that, it's also important to expose the mechanisms and the methodologies that the organization uses in order to kind of to victimize those people. I think so. I think that particular reviewer kind of made a complaint that I almost hadn't shown enough good stuff in Opus Dei, and you're like, that's not the point. Opus Dei, they can do that for themselves. They can talk about whatever good they do, whatever. My job as a journalist is to highlight the contradictions at the heart of this organization. An organization that professes to be a Christian organization, which, professes to help ordinary Catholics to kind of go deeper into their faith, but which at its heart is deeply unchristian and which is abusive and manipulative. That's the point of the book. It's not to repeat the kind of PR message that Opus Dei wants to push.
Absolutely. And I just want to affirm what you said. It's something that we feel, especially in working with the High Control series, of some people coming to us and saying, well, I had wonderful experiences in a covenant community. I had wonderful experiences within Side B Catholicism. Like in some ways, conversion therapy was helpful for me in my growth and understanding my identity. And those are experiences that a person has claimed and decided are their own. But just as you say, it's not necessarily a responsibility to forward a line of thinking or a line of justification for an organization that continues to harm people. Just as you say, I really appreciate that you include this information, and also that you highlight how people have left this organization and found ways out, and also how you challenge the idea that there is necessarily a black and white distinction between victimhood and perpetrator within these systems. Many, as you speak to, are, yes, we're victimized by systems of bureaucratic and organizational control, but themselves are very much perpetrators in systems of grooming and perpetuating elements of authoritarian control. With that being said, I did want to ask one more question. How did you come in contact with the people that have left this organization, and what did the separation and leaving process look like? What does it take for someone to untether themselves from an organization that has this much level of control and grooming?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously different for everyone, but I mean, the way, I guess, the way that I found a lot of these people was there are two particular communities of former Opus Dei members. One is a Spanish-speaking community, which is called Opus Libros, opuslibros.org. And the English-speaking community is Opus Dei Exposed, which is on Reddit. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess, that was my way into the communities of former members, and from those people then connected me to other former members as well. And I think it's a long and difficult process. I mean, I've spoken to people who left in the 1960s and 1970s who are still struggling to come to terms with what happened to them, who are still trying to get some form of some acknowledgement of what happened to them, and some, either apology or even financial compensation in some way as well. I think, it's a very long and difficult process. I think, I mean, there are obviously people like Dr. Steve Hassan who himself, having been in the Moonies, he understands, I guess, what many of these people have gone through. But I think a lot of professionals like Dr. Hassan because they hadn't directly been through the Opus Dei process and maybe not familiar with all the different kind of levels of control and the way things really work. So I think for a lot of these people, the best way, I guess, to come to terms with what's happened to them, the best way to seek help is kind of within the communities of former members themselves, because, they understand the way things work. They understand what, each other has been through. And so I think those groups of these communities of former members, are very supportive for people who are leaving, and for people who are still kind of grappling with what happened to them. It's kind of interesting. Recently, I think Opus Dei is feeling the heat, not just of my book and the documentary that you mentioned, The Heroic Minutes, an excellent documentary, which I encourage all of your listeners and viewers to go and watch. It's on HBO Max. But also, the Vatican is really starting to ask a lot of questions of Opus Dei. Pope Francis, began to take action in the years before he died. He downgraded the organization within the kind of hierarchy of the church, and he demanded that they reform themselves. That reform process is still ongoing. Pope Leo has been saying all the right things, but the proof will be in the pudding. We'll see what actual reform there is. But I think because of all of this kind of attention that it's getting, Opus Dei has felt in recent weeks the need to do something. So it's launched something in Spain. Spain is its biggest country by far, but maybe half of all members live in Spain. And it's launched this quite large process of, I forgot what they call it exactly. I think they call it a listening and understanding commission or something. So this thing is staffed by numerary members, and they're encouraging former members to reach out and share their experiences. And, if they have any grievances or any particular things they want to discuss, to approach the commission, and to talk about their experiences. I mean, there's been a very mixed reaction to this. I think there's been on the whole, it's been a very negative reaction. I think a lot of former members are kind of saying, what the hell? You, the perpetrators of this abuse, are asking us, the victims, to come to you and kind of share our stories with you. We don't feel comfortable sharing what's happened to us with you. And, in our eyes, Opus Dei is a manipulative and abusive organization. How can we trust you to make amends or, address our particular grievances? And so I think it's trying to look like it's doing something, but the very fact that it wants to address these issues internally, again, kind of comes back to the way they reacted to the book. I don't think there's a sincere desire to really get to the bottom of any of these problems, to really grapple with any of these issues of abuse and manipulation. They want to keep it all in-house. They want to keep it all quiet. They want to keep it all under control, because I think they fear that if there's a serious investigation of what really goes on and the way that they really operate, then they're going to be in trouble. And so, it's another attempt to cover up what's really going on, whilst at the same time trying to appear to be friendly and repenting and, wanting to make amends for past ills.
Yes. And it's funny because the next question I had for you was about the papacy and how Pope Francis, and then I kind of was curious, since when your work started in this investigation, it was during Pope Francis's time. So I was kind of curious, like, how you felt when Robert Prevost stepped out onto the balcony and was announced to the world as Pope Leo XIV, and kind of like what was going through your head, and a little bit more detail of what you've seen since then.
I guess, I'm not a Catholic myself, and so in many ways I don't really have skin in the game. I guess is I guess I was hoping for a pope that would be as willing as Francis to take on the church's problems and try to sort them out. I mean, Francis wasn't perfect. His record on tackling things like sexual abuse, really, left something to be desired. I think, he could have gone much further. There's all kinds of politics going on. I don't think the church is ready to really grapple fully with many of its issues. And part of that reason is, it doesn't want to turn even more Catholics away from the church. The impact of the sexual abuse scandal in the early 2000s in the US was brutal for the church in terms of the number of people attending, mass regularly. I think they don't want to have another situation like that. Also, financially speaking as well, if the church really grappled with many of its problems, it would be facing huge kind of damages, from former victims. So I think that there's a bit of policies going on. Maybe that's why he didn't get fully come, fully to terms with many of these problems. But he at least took a step in the right direction, certainly with Opus Dei. And so when Pope Francis sadly died and, the conclave was called, I was hoping that his successor would be someone of that ilk. And it looks, it's still early days. It looks like Pope Leo is someone who is willing to take on some of these issues. Certainly in Peru, he was involved in the suppression of the sodality of Christian life. They're another cultish, abusive organization that operated under the guise of the Catholic Church. That organization was suppressed earlier this year, Archbishop Prevost, as he was at the time, was heavily involved in ensuring that victims were heard and that the sodality was addressed in the right way. So, with that experience, I'm hopeful that he might take a similar view to Opus Dei. But we don't know. At the moment, there's this kind of standoff. Opus Dei was asked by Francis to rewrite its constitutions. There have been several kind of drafts of this. A number of drafts have been rejected. The latest draft was submitted, I think, in June, and we're still waiting to hear what the Pope's reaction to that is. I guess we will live and see, and we will wait in hope that he will do the right thing. It's kind of complicated as well. The whole issue was politicized. I think Prevost was elected partly because as a way of bridging the two sides of the church. The church has been deeply divided for some time. The right wing of the church was horrified at many of the things that Francis did. And I think, Prevost, although he's probably kind of shifts left and liberal, I think he's seen as a bridging force, someone who can maybe make gestures to the conservative wing of the church and kind of try to bring things back together. We've seen, the way that he's, embraced Latin Mass and this kind of thing is a way of making overtures to that part of the church and trying to bring everyone back in. So if that's what he's trying to do, I think going after Opus Dei is going to be quite difficult because that's going to open up these ruptures even further. So even if closing Opus Dei down is the right thing to do, I think that's probably highly unlikely because he doesn't want to create even deeper wounds within the church. Another issue is the fact that the founder of Opus Dei is a saint. This is a guy who's been canonized. And so to then turn around and say, you know what? This guy was actually an abuser and he actually kind of created this mythology that to this day continues to groom young children. Maybe he shouldn't be a saint anymore. That's not going to happen. The whole process of making someone into a saint is confirming that miracles have happened, confirming that this person is in heaven and is kind of interceding from heaven. Having already supposedly confirmed all of that, it would be a difficult thing for to reopen that that whole canonization process. I think, to my knowledge, the Catholic Church has never done that in its entire 2,000-year history. I don't think it's going to do that with Escrivá. So I think what we're likely to see is some kind of fudge where there are kind of, they make things better around the edges, that, they address certain specific issues within Opus Dei, but I fear the church will continue, will allow this cult of Escrivá to continue. And I think there will be many diehard members who, even if Opus Dei is forced to reform in certain ways, they'll carry on kind of, carrying out the teachings of Escrivá, for as long as they live, because they truly believe that this guy had a vision from God and is a saint, and, they continue to worship this guy.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you said that, because it's an issue that we haven't had a chance yet to explore, of navigating histories of abuse and sainthood. Because in the church, there's been no evidence and no specific examples of revoking sainthood, but there is kind of the demotion. As we've talked about before, folk saints like Saint Wilgefortis, Saint Christopher, Saint Philomena have been kind of demoted and taken off the canonical calendar because of lack of evidence or because of complicated, complex histories. But just as you say, saints that we know of in the church navigating and addressing this issue of the founder of Opus Dei would mean opening the door to navigating histories of how were saints involved in enslavement, how were saints involved in systems of missionary work, how were they involved in Christian boarding schools. So I think what you bring up is incredibly important.
I mean, I would say on that point, I do think if the church wanted to do something, there is kind of a way around it. I mean, I think the process of both the beatification process and the canonization process were both inherently flawed. There were a number of people who tried to give evidence to both of those processes who were basically kind of told to go away. And so I think, it would be a very difficult process. There would be a lot of soul searching for the church, but it would be possible, I think, for the Pope to reopen that process and say that, what happened in the 80s and 90s perhaps didn't fulfill the expectations of the church and due diligence, and, to maybe allow some of those people to be at last to be heard and to really examine, I guess, the full history of Opus Dei and the full personality of Escrivá, and make a new decision about whether or not he ought to be a saint again. So I don't think that the church will be willing to do that. I think, this is kind of pie in the sky, but I do think there's if it really wants to make amends, really wants to do the right thing, there is an avenue to do that without opening up this whole kind of, issue of, theology and canon law and the rest of it about whether it's possible to do this. I think you could just question whether the right process actually took place.
Absolutely. And also it means the church grappling with how its own specific power systems have been lent to legitimize Opus Dei, and navigating how, by continuing to maintain silence, it in many ways condones the histories and the present violence that it enacts against communities. I did want to ask, earlier I had shared that Kevin Roberts, architect of Project 2025, was revealed through a Guardian article investigation that he has ties to Opus Dei. How is Opus Dei involved not only in American nationalism, but in nationalist movements across the world? And do you see this as connected to kind of this shift and rise of authoritarian practices, just like we see in Opus Dei on a wider scale politically?
I'm not a conspiracy theorist. And also I should be clear that I'm not implying that the head of Opus Dei sat in Rome giving out orders to Kevin Roberts or to Donald Trump or whatever. But I think, the fact that, you look at the Opus Dei Center in central Washington, D.C., this place called the Catholic Information Center. If you look at the board of directors of that place, it's like a who's who of kind of right-wing, powerful political figures and legal figures in Washington. You've got people like Leonard Leo, people like Bill Barr, Pat Mulvaney, Mick Mulvaney and Pat Cipollone. You've, basically the kind of the great and the good of the Washington right-wing political elite. Now that's no accident. As I was saying before, I think from the very beginning, Opus Dei's intention has been to infiltrate the corridors of power. And so whenever it's set up in a new country, it's always directed its recruitment efforts at people who are in positions of power. And so I think it's completely unsurprising that many of the people, that a number of the people involved in things like Project 2025 and the Trump administration and the kind of wider, I guess, ecosystem of think tanks like the Heritage Foundation or whatever, people are involved in this kind of wider conservative agenda. I think it's no surprise that a number of them are affiliated to Opus Dei because Opus Dei has made a concerted effort to infiltrate that part of society because it wants to push through change. And I think, that the US is one example. But I think if you look at almost any country where Opus Dei operates, the very same playbook is being put into action. You look at, in places like Spain, you look at, the kind of far right parties like Vox and even kind of the center right parties like the PP, and, the connections to Opus Dei are all over the place. And that's because, it's kind of funny that, the rest of the church, if you want to become a Catholic or you want to join the Jesuits or whatever, you can just go to the organization, go to the website, go to your local church and say, look, I'm interested in doing this. In Opus Dei, that's not the way it works. You can't go to the Opus Dei website and say, look, I'm kind of thinking about joining, send me a brochure through the post or send me a form and I'll fill it out. Opus Dei decides who it wants to have as a member and it targets them. So, and, I think the way that it's quite successfully infiltrated the conservative political circles of Washington, D.C. and, the wider US and, other capitals around the world, I guess shows you, what its ambitions are. It wants Opus Dei to be politically influential. It wants the teachings of the Opus Dei founder to be politically influential. It wants to reshape the world according to the beliefs and vision of Escrivá and of Opus Dei more generally. It's not interested in pushing the kind of, I guess, more liberal Catholicism of Pope Francis or Pope Leo. It wants, it's pushing forward this kind of very conservative reading of Catholicism. I hope that answers your question.
I think that's incredibly important, and I appreciate you calling it out. More than anything, I think it's important that you approach this from a different perspective as someone who is not Catholic and someone approaching it from a financial perspective, which I think is really generative and interesting. We just had a conversation this past week with Lucas Wilson, someone who wrote Shame, Sex, Attraction, an anthology about conversion therapy, who experienced conversion therapy at Liberty University and grew up in an evangelical specific setting, but understanding how that bled together into Catholic practices is really, really fascinating. And I think the perspective that you bring of an outsider coming to this organization and analyzing it has given you a really unique bend to focus on how not only is this an element of manipulation practices, but cult-like behavior and weaponization of vulnerable populations is at the core of what makes Opus Dei continue to succeed.
Yeah, I think I was very, thank you for your kind word. I think I was very fortunate in that I fell into this story by accident. And so I didn't come to it through a kind of prism of, I'm interested in religion, I'm going to write about, the theology of this group, or I'm interested in politics, I'm going to write about the politics of this group. I literally just followed the money and connected, and then following the money opened my mind to this, it showed me just how the organization operates. So, it just showed me how, on the one level, the organization operates in terms of recruitment or whatever, but then showed me how how it operates this network of schools and how it's connected to all of these think tanks and all these politicians. And then it was a case of kind of trying to make sense of all of that by, through interviews and through, various documents I got my hands on. But it was, I think it was an advantage to come to this by accident because I didn't really have any particular agenda and wasn't interested in a particular narrative. I just kind of allowed myself to be led by the facts and by the money.
Yes, and we think that's so important, and we are so grateful for you joining us today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. This conversation about Opus Dei's culture, its impact on members, and how the church has begun to respond really helps shed light on why naming and addressing the harms of high control Catholic practices matters so much. Before we wrap up, was there anything else we didn't touch on today that you would like to make sure our listeners know about or are aware of?
Not really. I guess the one big thing that could still bring Opus Dei down is that at the moment there's a human trafficking investigation going on in Argentina. So the organization is accused of recruiting young girls into a life of servitude there, going out and specifically lying to them, grooming them and coercing them into joining, and then of trafficking them around the world, working for free for the organization in various countries. Investigators there, the kind of state prosecutors, I guess you would call them in the US, state prosecutors there are compiling a case, and it looks like they will be indicting at least 4 Opus Dei priests, including the number 2 of the organization globally. And so I think that's a very interesting development. So on the one hand, you've got the Vatican trying to grapple with this problem, trying to force the organization to reform, and you've got this additional pressure from potential criminal prosecution as well. So, there's certainly lots to keep our eyes on. And, let's just hope that, one of those two things or both those things eventually forces some real change and some real, accountability as well.
Gareth, thank you for your time and for sharing all of these things. I know our questions and the work that you do is incredibly difficult, engaging with power systems and systems of violence and abuse, but I really appreciate the work that you do and taking time to speak with us today. I think what you shared is really, really powerful.
Well, thank you both to you guys for having me on. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for also shedding a light on these important issues as well.
That's a lot to take in, but it really shows why these conversations matter, not just for people who've been directly involved with Opus Dei, but for anyone paying attention to how power works in the church.
Exactly. High control groups don't just shape individuals, they shape institutions and even national politics. Naming that reality is the first step towards change.
We're grateful to everyone who shared their stories and expertise with us, and to you for listening and engaging in all of these topics.
Until next time, keep asking questions and keep imagining a more free, more honest church.
Goodbye.